both technologies. And by that, we mean any type of language processing tool or service, be it, let's say, lower level function like lemmatization, part of speech tagging, or named or tokenization, named entity recognition, but also full end-to-end applications like machine translation, speech recognition, speech synthesis, which themselves can be put together, can be combined into creating a full pipeline of speech-to-speech translation. But not only language technologies, it also has, as presented again in the Meta Forum, data resources like corpora, and by that we mean datasets, not only text datasets, but also multimedia ones that include video recordings or audio recordings, even images that come with some kind of language material with them, as you can see here as well. Lexical and conceptual resources, and by that we mean glossaries, term lists, computational dictionaries, morphological dictionaries, thesauri, but also ontologies and semantic lexica. Models, machine learning models, statistical models, etc., and of course computational grammars. And not only language resources, but also organizations and projects. You can find here also all the organizations that are involved in the life cycle of a language resource or technology. Creators, providers, funders that have created, that have funded projects. And that's an impressive list, I think, that we have. And that shows the dynamics of the language technology domain. As you can see, the catalog can be browsed, or you can search through facets, language technologies, etc., functions for services, or the intended application for which a resource has been created. So for instance, you can search for resources that have to do with, that are intended for sentiment analysis, and you can limit your search, for instance, for corpora, and further limit it for specific languages. Not only official EU languages, but also other EU languages and other languages, they're categorized so that they're easier to find. So let's go through one of them. You can also search in the facets, sorry, let me close that, make it easier, with licenses and some conditions of use for data sets, the most frequently asked for, the obvious ones. So you can click, you have a snippet of information about these resources that you have found, and then you can click on it and find further information for that. Sorry, I think, yeah. I'll stop my video because today I think my internet connection is a little bit bad. Let me go again. I don't know why it takes such a long time. It shouldn't. Yeah, and here it is. So you can find more information on its resource. The resource is, there are some information which is the same one for all resource types. The versioning, in additional information, a landing page where you can find more information, funding projects, and for its resource, but also information which is specific to its resource type. The description is the same, is found here for all types of resources. Keywords, intended applications, so this one is meant for sentiment analysis, aspect-based sentiment analysis, and it's an annotated corpus. Information specific to the corpora, it's a text, it's a corpus only of texts for Italian and its reviews. You can find information on documentation, publications where this resource is described, GDPR-related information, whether it contains personal or sensitive data, and whether it has been anonymized. And as we said before, all the agents that are connected to this resource. You can also see information on how it's licensed, the data format, the size. This one contains 4,121 texts. And depending on the license information, you can also download it. As I said, you can also find information on the funding project, and these are linked together with the resources. So we can go and see what this project, this is a resource that came from a pilot project. You can have an overview of the project itself. Again, administrative information is at the right-hand side, project information, funders, funding scheme categories, etc. The resources that they have provided, either funded them or provided them, quite a long list for this project. And you can also find information on the coordinators and the participants in this site. And if you, if you click on the coordinator, you can also find information for this specific organization. Link again, information on what they're doing, keywords, disciplines, language technology areas, where the organization resides, whether it's an academic institution, and what its role is in the language technology domain. Again, a link to the resources that this specific organization has created, but also the projects that they're coordinating, or whether where they are participating. You can have also information on the divisions. If it's a university or a parent organization, let's say, you can also have a look at the divisions, and you can click on them and visit the web page for each of the divisions as well. Let me, for the sake of time, go back to the catalog. Have a look also briefly at a model. For instance, the Bangor University's Well Speech Recognition Acoustic Model. This is something that we're currently working on. Not a lot of models yet, but they're coming up. So again, as I said before, similar look and feel for models as well. You can also download it if it's accessible, if it's hosted in ELG. This one is not, but you have information on where you can access it from. If you click on it, you will be redirected to the access location. And you also have some relations to the service that deploys this model, if there is one. And this one is an ELG compatible service. So you can actually use the model with this service. Information again for a language technology service, an overview, all the information here. If you have multiple versions of it, if it has been updated, you will also see here all the versions, resource provider, funding project, but also the technical information, which is very important, and that the next presentations will show you how to fill in. It's very important that we have this information so that users, consumers can find your services and your resources, but also to integrate them and properly have them operating through the ELG platform. So the information for services, language, what input is the language, and what the output, the output language, but also the type of files or formats that they get, WAV audio, JSON is the output. The function, very important for findability, speech recognition, whether it's language dependent. Think of this that also, for instance, for machine translations, you would have a different type of language for input and outputs. Obviously, if this one is text is input audio, for text, you would have also another type of data formats. What you can do with them, I will not go through them through this screen because this will be shown later on. You can say you can specify the license with which this resource can be downloaded from. And we have two specific tabs, which are for trying out, testing for running the service. In order to run all the ELT compatible services, you have to be logged in. And in order to log in, we have here the logon, the sign up. And you see here the tryout tab. I will not go through that because this will sound later on, but we have different APIs just to say for the different types of categories of service categories that we have. Samples, again, this will be shown later, but basically you can call a service either through a command line or use a Python SDK service that will be shown to you later on. And again, we have a link to the related language resources and technologies to the model in this case. As I said before, you can also search in a number of ways, both through the facet, but also through the free text search bar, which also supports advanced queries, using advanced queries. So can either ask for summarize, and you get hits for both for summarizer and summarization. And you can, again, use both the filters and the free text bar together to limit your searches. So you can limit the service to services and have a look at a specific service, the multi-document, multilingual summarization, which is the one that will be used as an example in the next presentations on how to integrate the service. And with this, I conclude the consumer's point of view, and I give the floor to the next presenter, that will be Dimitris Galanis first, to inform you about the specifications for ELT compatible services. So I'll stop sharing my screen. And the floor is to you, Dimitris. If you have any questions, please put them to the Q&A tool, and we will answer them at the end of this session.
So you can hear me, right? And you can see my screen. Yes, you can see my screen.
Yes, yes.
Yes. Oh, thank you. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
I can see your PowerPoint windows better.
Yes. Okay. This is this presentation is for integrated services into ELT. I'm Dimitris Galanis from ILSP, a partner in the ELT project. And okay, Penny have already presented the catalog, which is the ELT catalog, which is a web-based application. This catalog, as you have seen, we host various types of resources. All resources are documented and described using the ELT metadata schema, which is a rich metadata schema appropriate for many types of resources. We host things like lexica, we host things like machine learning models, datasets, and also we have language technology services, NLP services, language technology services. they also are described with the ELG metadata schema. The difference is that we have that some of them can be are integrated to the ELG platform. This means that they can be called. They can put some sample input in the trial UIs of the catalog, and we can call them and get some response and see what they actually are doing. So there is a procedure for integrating these LT services, and I will show this procedure and what you need as a provider to do it. So all published resources are visible by anyone in the ELG catalog. This means that the login is not required. However, in the case of integrated services, when you want to call them, you want to try them with some sample input, you have to log in. Okay, it's not difficult. You can register to the ELG platform, get a username, password, and log in and start using them. If you want to be provider, again, you have to be logged in, provider of any source, in particular of an LT service. You have to log in, and then there is a procedure you can apply for a provider. You can become a provider in the platform. So if you do that, there is an admin space. You can go there to migrate, and you can use there are two ways to provide a resource. You can use the interactive editor. You can upload your metadata. If you do that, for example, you can describe your language technology service, and if you do that, you can press a button and then ask from the platform to be published. After that, if you do that, validation process is starting, and this will be described in this presentation. And when it's completed, your service or other resource will be published in the catalog and will be visible to anyone. So the architecture of the ELG platform is shown in this graph, in this image. You have there are three layers. There's a base layer where we have some of the machines. Everything in ELG runs in a Kubernetes cluster, and runs as containers in a Kubernetes cluster. There is a file object storage where we put the files of the resources. We have a Docker registry repository for putting the Dockers for the Docker containers that host the applications, etc. As all the other applications of ELG, the LT services will run as Docker containers in these clusters, and these are in this graph, and this image are shown here. We have these are the LT services that we are hosting and we are offering to the users. All these services are in front of the services. There is an execution service, execution server that implements a common public to all users API. It's a REST API, and a user. So this is a user can use this server and can access the server through this API and actually use one of the integrated services in two different ways. The one is go to the catalog user interface where some test trial user interfaces are embedded, and use them. And these UIs call the public API, and you can through them you can get some you can give some input and get some output from the services, or you can in a very similar way you can use a command line tool, our Python SDK, standard development kit, where you do the same things from the command line with a more with a programmatic way. Okay, you can see more details. You can read more details about the the whole architecture and the service execution server and the REST API that it offers in our documentation, this page of our documentation. So what you have to do, okay, this is the whole picture. What you have to do for integrating service, actually you have to implement this interface because the execution server that provides the public API communicates with its individual LT service using an internal LT service API, also a REST API. So you have to know about it, you have to implement it, and you have created a Docker container for providing service to the ELG platform. Okay, this internal API is described also in our documentation on this page. Okay, it's detailed, covers all the cases, all the different cases. And your Docker image, when you create a Docker image, you have to push it. It has to be pushed in a public Docker registry like Docker Hub, GitLab, and from there our deployment procedure will get them and deploy it in our Kubernetes cluster. So. What kind of services can be integrated in the platform? Currently, okay, you have, it's much easier to integrate something if you fall into one of the following very broad categories. For example, you can have information, these are 5 categories. You can have an information extraction tool, like a named entity recognizer, like a segment analyzer. You can have a text classification tool for documents. For example, you can have a language identifier that identifies the language of a text. You can have machine translation systems for pair of languages, and you can have a speech recognizer or text-to-speech systems. If you fall in one of these 5 categories, then the requirements for integrating the service are, first, you have, as already said, you have to implement an ELG compatible endpoint. Actually, you have to follow and implement the internal language technology API, REST API, defined, specified by the ELG consortium. And then, so you have to create an application with an ELG compatible endpoint. Then you have to get this application, the software, and put it in a Docker container, which Docker image that will be uploaded to a Docker registry. Okay, but if you don't fall into these 5 categories, then you are a special case. And if you are a special case, okay, you have to contact with the ELG technical team, and then you have, in this case, let's say a special technical approach solution should be adopted, should be implemented for you. For example, this is a record for the Korean Sparkle endpoint, and you can open it and see it. It's actually, this resource actually is a service. It is a thesaurus, and it doesn't actually fit in any of these 5 categories. From this source can be queried. You can get some things from it, and you do that by the offered Sparkle endpoint. And to do that, to integrate this the service in ELG, we have created something like a proxy, a special proxy for the Korean endpoint, and this is how it's offered from our platform. So let's go to the not the special case, the typical cases where we have 2 technical requirements. The first one is to create an ELG compatible endpoint. I have already described it. You have to create a REST endpoint, a TCP endpoint that should follow the ELG specs. This means that it should consume messages in the ELG JSON format, and also call the underlying language technology tool, produce some response, and these responses should be transformed to the respective ELG JSON format for the output. Okay, this is our ELG Athena API. For example, in the case of the first case of the information extraction tools, the JSON format of the request is on the left side of this slide. You have to create a JSON message like this, where you define that the type of this request is for text. You have some optional parameters. In most cases, they're not used, but in some cases they are used. There is a field content where you put the content that will be processed. You have to define the MIME type. In this case, it's text plain. And there are also some additional things which are optional. But the response in this case, in the case of information extraction tools, is a JSON message. Its type is annotations. And actually, the important thing here is that it will return a list of annotations. For example, if you have a named entity recognizer, the annotations will be, each annotation will be for each identified named entity, and each named entity will have a starting offset, an ending offset in the text, and some features. For example, a feature could be the type of the named entity. It can be a person, location, organization, etc. So if you do that, if you have created an application and it exposes a REST compatible endpoint, follows the respective ELG API, then the only thing that you have to do is to put this application, the software, in a Docker image and push it in the Docker registry. For those that haven't worked with Docker images, a Docker image actually of an application actually is a large file, it's a bundle that contains the code of application of the tool. It contains all the software dependencies, configuration files, frameworks, settings, etc. that are needed from the tool to run. And the a Docker container actually is an instantiation that's created from a Docker image. You can thought a Docker container like something like a very lightweight, easily transferable virtual machine. And how you create this Docker image? You create it by creating a Docker file, where it's a text file where you put some instructions. For example, you have the first instruction is you define the operating system. In this case, this is a Linux-based operating system that also contains OpenJDK Java. It means the Java programming language. You have also to add your application with the respective command. This is a jar file. This my application here is a Java-based application bundled the jar file. And you have to add a command that adds this application in the Docker file. And you have also to define the working directory. When the container starts, what's the working directory that will start up your application and expose the resting point. In order to okay, so if you create this Docker file, then there are commands. You can for creating the Docker image, there's a Docker build command where you go to the directory that this Docker file is placed, and you define the name for the name and the location, the same thing for the image that you create. This is the ID location of the image, and then if you created this bundle, there's a second command for pushing it into a Docker registry. Here we push it in the Docker registry of GitLab. Okay, so you have, this is the procedure. You have three different integration options for putting things in ELG. The first is when you have, when you put your language technology tool in a container, as described now, you create the ELG compatible REST point container, and this is the first case. Okay, this is the easiest one. The second is that you don't have you have a Docker container with the tool, but it follows doesn't follow the ELG spec, so you have to create a second image, an adapter image out of the container that follows the ELG specs and translates the ELG messages to the messages and the format that your image is offering. The third case is when you don't want to offer your Docker images to run in our ELG cluster in the ELG platform, and then you have it deployed in your own server, and you have to offer to the you have to provide to the ELG a proxy container that, as the adapter container, translates the ELG messages, compatible messages to your own server, to the service, to the endpoints that your server and service is offering. Okay, so these are the three integration options. The common thing is that all of them need a thing that is ELG compatible, so that the server, the LT service server, can use for calling the service. So okay, so these are the three basic options. In order to help you, we have created, this is a documentation page in our documentation platform, and providing many details for the procedure. We have examples on how to Dockerize and how to create a Python or a Java-based application tool, how to offer it as a service, and how to Dockerize it. And the most common options are to use a Python programming language or Java programming language. So we have created examples and instruction for these two cases. And you can see the details now in the respective pages. So if you have done all this and you have the image ready, Dockerized and pushed to a Docker registry, you can go to the platform, you can press the migrate button on the top of the platform, and then you can go over here to the add items button section, and there are two ways to create the respective metadata. The first is to the visual metadata editor, where you do some forms, and the other one is that you can upload an XML that contains in an XML format the metadata elements, metadata description of your source, of your service. In both cases, if something is missing, if something is not compatible with the ELG schema, you will get a report and you will correct your metadata. And finally, you will get, you will be able to complete it and to be syntactically valid according to our schema. And then the final step is to press the button for submitting it for publication. And this is the last step of the procedure. When you press this button, the request for publishing the resource is assigned to two validators, validator A and B. B checks the legal aspects of your service. A checks the metadata of the service if they are semantically consistent. For example, if you describe an entity recognizer, but okay, you have something that in the description that is not very compatible with that, it's not, it does not describe it actually a recognizer, then the validator will contact with you to correct some things. And also a validator A deploys your tool to our cluster and checks if it is actually can be called, follows the EXG specs, can be called from the platform. Both validator identity provider can test the service through the trial UIs that we offer. And these UIs, this is also not visible by anyone else than these two people. And also the validator has access to the backend, to the container logs. He can troubleshoot the container, etc. So when all the validators check everything, they will check a box that the things are okay, correct, and the results will be automatically published to the catalog. And final slide, when you do that, you go to the My Items in your My Grid, and you will see a list of your services that have been published. And then you can, for example, request one published on a service. You can, and if you have a new version of it, you can very easily press here from the action buttons, create new version, and create easily, much more easily, a new version of this service. And now I think should, sorry for the 2 extra minutes, if we go to Rémi for describing, for saying some things about the Python SDK.
Yes, thanks. Can you stop sharing so that I can start my screen, please? Okay, perfect. Now you should be able to see my screen. So yeah, as Dimitris said, I will give you an example on how to create ELG services based on a Python LT tool. So as Dimitris said, to create an ELG compatible service, you need to do 2 things. First of all, you need to create on top of your LT tool a HTTP endpoint, and this HTTP endpoint needs to be compatible with the internal LT service API, which means it needs to use one of those 3 request message type, but we will see later exactly what does it mean. And also it needs to respond one of those 4 response message. So my demonstration today is based on this GitLab repository. So I will put the link in the chat in case you want to follow what I will do yourself, or if you want to have a look maybe later. So first of all, let's have a look at the LT tool we want to deploy into ELG. So we took an example of a summarization tool using the transformer library. So the transformer library, just in 2 words, it's Python libraries from Hugging Face, which facilitates the use of transformers models. So I have my transformer model in this folder. So it's a DistilBart model, and I can simply load the model, load the tokenizer. Here it's the text I want to summarize. So it's a pretty long text. And after that, I can simply generate my summary. So I can run again this script. So just to see that my LT tool is actually working. So it's not a fast tool, but it will generate the summary after a couple of seconds. Okay, so now here I have my summary, and I want from this LT tool that is running locally, I want to create a ERG-compatible service. So first of all, I need to create this HTTP endpoint. So to do that, we can use different tools or services. Here for this demonstration, I choose to use Fast API. So Fast API is a library to create very easily server and so HTTP endpoints. And with this library, you simply, so here I import basically the library. You need to create an application, and then you can simply create your post endpoint like that. So just to go through this file, what I did is that I loaded my model and my tokenizer, which corresponds to my LT tool. And then here I create the HTTP endpoint. So this HTTP endpoint needs to be a post endpoint, so it needs to accept post requests. And it also needs to accept a specific type of messages. So here as it is a summarization service, it will accept as input a text request message. And so this text request message needs to follow a specific structure, which is described in our documentation. Here it is the JSON format. So as you can see, it needs to have a type. It can have parameters. It needs to have contents, and there is also more optional parameters. So here I define like the minimum fields I need to declare. So the types, the contents, and parameters, which is optional. And so this corresponds to the request message my endpoint will accept. After that, I simply run my tool. So as I did in the run.py script. So I tokenize my input, generate the summary, and decode the summary to obtain my result. And also, as my endpoint needs to respond a specific response message, I need to be sure that this dictionary I response from the request corresponds to the specification of the internal LT service API. So if we look again to the documentation, my service is a summarization service, so it will respond a text response. And this is the structure of the text response. So as you can see, it needs to start with a response key, then in this response key, another dictionary with a type and the text field. And this text field is an array of text, and a text is basically a content or other text. So in my case, it will simply be a content. So here it is what I respond. So a response that contains texts, and each for this use case, there is only one text with my summary. So just by creating this file, we have our HTTP endpoints that we can quickly test to make sure it works. So what I will do is I will start the server, and then I will quickly do a post request to this server on the endpoint we just created. So to do that, I do it in Python, and I use a request library, which is mainly used to do HTTP requests. And so I do the post request on the process endpoint, which is the endpoint. Which is the endpoint we declared just here. And I hope you can. Oh, sorry, I didn't start the response. So now I just called my LT tool, which is running inside my FAST API server. And so again, after a couple of seconds, I will get my response back. And if I inspect the response, you can well see that my summary is just here with the same structure as defined. And so this structure is correct because this structure is compatible with the ELG REST server. So now we have our HTTP endpoints. We need to create our Docker image so that the ELG compatible service can be deployed inside the cluster. And to do that, as Dimitris said, we need to create a Docker file. So this is what I did here. This is a pretty simple Docker file. Basically, we need a Python-based image. Then also we need to install some dependencies. So those two dependencies are for my LT tool, and those other three dependencies are for my FAST API server. So we install those dependencies, and also we need to import or to copy our transformer model inside our Docker container. And we also need to, of course, copy the code for the server inside the container. And after that, we simply need to run the FAST API server with the same command I used just before. And so now that we have declared the Docker file, I can build my image using the Docker CLI. So I will copy paste the command and build my image. Usually it takes a bit of time, but as I did that just before, it should be cached and pretty quick. Perfect. So I have my image ready to run locally. So I will run it and we will test it again. So as you can see, my server now is started. So I can again test it with the exact same piece of code. And also when I run the Docker image, I make sure to expose the port 80, which is the port we use to run the server. And so again, I can call the server. As you can see, we will get a post request. And after a few seconds, we will obtain the response back from the service. Okay, well done. So just to sum up, we have our LT tool, which is exposing an HTTP endpoint compatible with the ELG messages. And this HTTP endpoint, so this HTTP server, is packaged in one Docker image. So we filled all the requirements to create this ELG compatible service. The only last thing we need to do is to push this Docker image to a Docker registry so that we can pull the image to deploy it inside the ELG cluster. Because the Docker image is currently only in my local computer, but of course it needs to be pushed and accessible to everyone. So you can use the Docker registry you want. For this demonstration, I simply create a little continuous integration file in GitLab, which basically built a Docker image on each commit. And so you can see that in my GitLab repository, if you go to the container registry, I have my application, which corresponds to this image. So now the ELG technical team, so us, we will be able to deploy this service inside our inside the cluster. I think for time reason, I won't go to in the second example, but I would simply like to let you know that we also have created a Python SDK, so a Python package for ELG, sorry, and this package will give you some tools and utilities to do the exact same steps we just did with Fast API, but a little more easily. So it works as follows. You simply need to import a specific class from the package, and you need to extend this class and to override a specific method. So in this case, you need to override this process text method. And once it's done, you simply need to run a little ELG CLI to create the Docker file, and every file is needed to create a Docker image. And after that, you simply will need to build the image and to push it in a Docker registry. So if you are interested, you can have a look to this example, or you can also have a look to the documentation, which provides more explanations. So what we have now is we have our ELG service. So we have our Docker image publicly available in GitLab. And so we would now need to create the service in the ELG cluster, but this will be explained by Jan Roberts. So maybe I can stop sharing my screen and let Jan explain the next step. Jan? Perfect.
Hi everybody. I'm in Roberts University of Sheffield, and I'm going to talk a bit about the kind of catalogue side of things. So what sort of Dimitris and Rémi have been talking through so far is about the sort of technical side of how you implement your services and actually produce the Docker container, which is technically compatible with ELG. So what the next stage after that is actually registering your service in the ELG catalog. So I'm going to sort of go into a bit more detail on that. So Penny introduced the catalog at the beginning of the session and mentioned that obviously you have to sign in to be able to use or provide language technologies or resources or records of any kind to the ELG. So if you haven't already, then you need to register as a provider on the ELG. So when you sign up, you initially just you start off just as a quote consumer of the ELG records. If you want to provide your own records, then there's an extra step on the homepage. You need to click the become a provider, and we just do some very simple essentially spam checks before we approve that. It's not a big deal, but we just wanted to have an extra sort of approval stage. So once your request is approved to become a provider, then you get your this link to my grid on the ELG, and you can then create your items. So there, as Dimitris mentioned earlier, there are sort of two approaches for doing for providing metadata records to the ELG. I'm going to talk mainly about the interactive metadata editor here. There is an alternative which involves uploading your metadata records in XML, but we generally recommend that you go through the kind of manual process at least once or twice before you to kind of iron out any issues before you get too deep into the XML format. So if you want to, what we're adding in this case is a service, but a lot of this is exactly the same if you're adding a corpus or a language description or any other kind of resource organization or anything like that. Essentially, you go to my grid, you go to create items, and then there are there are buttons for all the various types that you might want to add. So in this case, we're doing a service or a tool. So the first stage is checking for duplicates. So make sure we want to try and avoid two people registering the same service. So you start by entering a name, and we do a kind of initial check to see if there's already a same or similar named service in the catalogue. And if there isn't, then you can proceed to create one. Now, the step 2, ELG, like we said before, we can list both services that are ELG compatible services. That's what we've been talking about with the Docker images that can run within the ELG cluster. But also we can list records for services and tools that are things that you maybe download and run locally. And it changes slightly what's on the forms. So if you're submitting an ELG compatible service, you have to say, yes, this is a tool that will be integrated as a compatible service. And then this takes you through to the kind of catalogue edit page that Penny was talking earlier on about, kind of how it looks on the consumer side. I'm gonna sort of show you how that corresponds to what you want to enter in the metadata editor form. So there's basic, obviously this looks like a very complicated form, and it is a very complicated form, but that's because it's one form that tries to cover a lot of different cases and a lot of different combinations of parameters. There's a relatively small number of key fields which you need to fill in, and a lot of optional elements. So as I go through, I'm going to kind of highlight the most important bits and the bits that you must be in there in order to get it to be acceptable. So for the first tab is sort of general metadata for language resources, technologies. This applies to everything. So the key points here, we've got the name, the description, and the version number, and those are the kind of key bits. And then aside from that, you can also add things like your logo and links to the provider and the funding project. And that's something, again, that Penny was stressing earlier on. It's really helpful in terms of findability for your records, if you can add metadata records for your organization and for the project and things like that have sponsored your services. And then when you come to create the services, you can link them to the funding project, and everything kind of links together nicely and is much easier for people to explore. So the second tab on here is the categories tab. Is the key ones here is the intended application and keywords that are required. So the intended application is typically, what for services, this will generally be the type of service that it is, but this also allows you to link together, services that do machine translation with, models that are for machine translation, libraries or corpora that are intended for training machine translation and so on. So that's the intended application, and then keywords are just free text keywords. Notice that a lot of the fields on these forms have got this language tag with a little plus button here. We generally require that whenever there's a multilingual option like this, you have to provide an English version, just so that we've got one kind of guaranteed common set. But you can also add, if you click the plus button, you can add alternatives in different languages. So, obviously, if you're doing something like a French language tool, for example, you might want to add the keywords and the descriptions and things in a French version as well as an English version. Then the contact tab is the contact details where users of this service would go for support. So we require at minimum either a landing page, a web page that's a kind of contact page for you, or an email address. You can also link to existing actors, so people or organizations or projects that already exist in the catalogue. The documentation tab is links. We're now into the optional parts. This is the links to the documentation for your services. And if you're an academic provider, obviously often what you'll have is anybody who uses this service should please cite this article. So you can put the preferred citation and things like that. Related LRTs is for linking together items that are related to this one in some way, whether it's, this is a part of this, this service uses this model, and so on. The previous versions link will be filled in for you automatically if this is a new version of an existing tool. Second tab, tools and services. This is the stuff that's specific to services. So the first one, this is for all services, whether they're ELG integrated compatible ones or not. The most important things on here is the function, the service function, which again, this is where you would, for a service, you'll say what the service does. So it might be named entity annotation, it might be speech recognition, machine translation, summarization, and so on. There's a kind of controlled vocabulary that you choose from of the sort of typical functions that we recommend. But in a lot of these cases, there are you can add your own values, and periodically we will go through the kind of the free text values that people have added, and if there's ones that keep coming up time and time again, we will add them to the controlled vocabulary for future use. But yeah, the function is one of the critical ones which we need you to specify, and if your records will be rejected if they don't have a function specification. The technical tab is where you specify the input and output and the parameters that your service can use, and I'm going to go into a lot more detail on this tab in a minute, because there's a lot of little potential pitfalls on here. So the first thing is, if your service is one that processes specific languages, and I guess most of them are, aside from just things like audio segmentation, just based on silences and things, most services will be dependent to some degree on the language that's in use. So we start with we allow, so the switch at the top that says language dependent, set that on, and what that then does is it means that for the input and output resources that you're specifying, you now have to select a language or multiple languages that the input can be in. So for languages, we use BCP47 language tags. So it's not just English or German, it could be Austrian German. It's not just Serbian, it could be Serbian in Cyrillic versus Serbian in Latin alphabet. So you can put, regions, variants, scripts as well, dialects, so you can really, pin these languages down as tight as you like. There's a few sort of de facto standards that we've come into. So where you've got services that analyze text or audio and produce just annotations rather than more text or more audio as output, then we would recommend use output resource type file, data format, JSON, the same languages for the output as well for the input, and then the relevant annotation types. And the annotation types is another one where we have a controlled vocabulary, but you can add additional entries of your own if you can't find anything appropriate. For machine translation, obviously you specify the source languages on the input side and the target languages on the output side. It can be more than one language if you've got like a multilingual service, a single service that can cope with input in many languages. We would very strongly encourage you, when you're submitting your services, to supply sample data. And if your service can take several languages, then please supply at least one sample for each input language. So the samples, I'll show you more on this later. I put all the details in the slides because I think we're going to share the slides later, so this is more for you to refer back to than anything else. You can also declare parameters if your service takes parameters or requires parameters. But I would say that the parameter declarations that you put in the metadata are only really fair for the benefit of the tryout GUI and any other sort of interfaces into it. But we don't we don't enforce the parameter. We don't check the parameter values against the metadata at the execution endpoint. So you still have to verify that and return errors for invalid parameters in your own code. Essentially, you don't trust the user is a fairly standard rule for any online service. And for technical reasons, there's a few parameter names that you can't use because they're used internally by the system. So I'll show you this in more detail with the specific service that that Rémi was just talking about. The evaluation tab is just the main thing on there is a TRL technology readiness level, which is a sort of everything from early prototype through to proven commercial, proven scaled up commercial service. You can add a TRL if that is relevant to your project. The distribution tab is the key one really for ELG integrated services that tells ELG where to find your code. So I don't know if you can read the screenshot, but I'll show you this in live in a minute. Essentially, the distribution form should always be Docker image. There's a flag that says private, yes or no. So the idea is that you tell us where we can download the code from in the Docker download location, which is that's the Docker image reference. The private flag is whether or not we should advertise that location to the world. So if it's an open source service, you probably want people to be able to pull the Docker image themselves and run it locally. If it's a commercial service, then probably not. So that's what the private flag is about. So the Docker download location, like I say, is an image reference telling us where we can pull your image from. If possible, please try and avoid using the latest Docker tag. We prefer kind of fixed version tags if possible. Service adapter download location. So if you're doing this as a kind of main container plus a service adapter container that Dimitris was talking about, then this is the same thing for the service adapter. Execution location is the other really key one. That is basically, that is the URL within the running container where the endpoint is exposed. So in the case of Rémi's image that he just produced with the Fast API, that would be HTTP localhost/process. So the port number is, so you always express it as localhost, and then the port number is the port which the container exposes, and the path is the path within the URL space on that container. Additional hardware requirements is where you specify if your service needs significant amounts of memory, or if it requires GPU capacity or anything like that. Although we don't currently have GPUs available, they are on the roadmap for future. I think by default we allow 500 megabytes of memory and about half a CPU as our kind of default value. If you need more than that, then specify it in the hardware requirements. The other key one is license. Now, we have something of a proliferation of different licenses, and in some cases, several different copies, several different identifiers for the same license, and it's a bit of a mess at the moment. So, if possible, when you're choosing the license, if you're open source software, please use. We've got all the SPDX license options, so please try and stick to those if possible. So things like Apache, MIT, GPL, LGPL, and so on. For closed source services, you can add your own license terms with a link to your own licensing web page. And as I say, we don't yet have a concept of kind of billings and subscriptions in ELG, but that is on the roadmap for the first half of next year. Once we have the ELG legal entity up and running as something that can actually receive and hand out money. So that this is really the key one for the integrated services. Yes, so as I say, there's a few little notes. If possible, please try and reuse existing values rather than creating your own from scratch. And if you've got if you have a research project or something that's produced your tools or resources, then please create metadata records for your organization and funding projects and so on, and link things together properly. So you would typically create your organization record first, then you create a project that links to the organization, and then you create the services that link to the project. Because this just makes it a lot easier to find your records. It helps promote your organization or project. And just having everything kind of linked together makes for much easier faceted search. ELG platform automatically creates all the backlinks. So if a project says, if a service says it's funded by the project, then the project record will link forward to the service. Like I say, we also support importing metadata records from XML, which is a good approach if you've got many similar records. For example, if you develop, like we have one of the pilot projects was Opus machine translation, where they have one machine translation engine, and then a whole host of 50, 60, 100 plus models. So we end up with a whole lot of very similar services, which are all based on the same engine. So in that case, what I would recommend you do is create your first service through the metadata editor and go through the whole process, the manual cycle, get it approved, get it sorted out. And then when the record is published, you can export the XML and then use that as a template for building your other records and upload them through the upload items option in the grid. So as I say, I would recommend going through the manual cycle at least once to iron out all the little niggles before you switch to using XML records. Because if you submit 50 records in one go and then they all have the same problem, then that makes a lot of work for the ELG validators. So yeah, as I say, the form is complex. There's no getting away from that because it's one form that needs to cover many different scenarios, and you will make mistakes. We all do. We all have many times. But that's okay. We're here to help. So if anything is unclear, there's a feedback link at the top of the My Grid where you can make contact with us directly through a ticketing system, or you can. The other thing, as I said, as Dimitris was saying, there's the whole validation cycle. So fill in as much as you can, submit the record for publication, and then once it's assigned to a technical validator, the validator will be in touch directly to help with any, to help you resolve any issues with your records before they can go live. So what I'll show you now is this is an example based on the service that Rémi just demonstrated in his segment. This is the multi-document multilingual summarization. So when you come to submit, or you start building your records, you end up in this metadata editor, as I sort of showed you before. And so yeah, the identity tab gives you things like the name, the identifier, the description, and again, as I say, these things are all multilingual. So I could add, I could add a German description. I don't personally speak German, but you can add these these descriptions and entries in many different languages. I think the portal kind of adapts to the language of the browser. I think that's the idea. So if your browser is set up in German, you would get the German description. And then, as you can see here, these have already been linked to the existing records for DFKI as the resource provider and Curator as the funding project. the way this is what you kind of see initially. So I would start searching for curator, and you can just pick the existing record and it does the link for you automatically. And that information all comes from the existing record. So this is it's quite easy to link these together once the project type records already exist. Categories. So yeah, as I said, the intended application summarization in this case. And if we look, this is where the description comes up here, the intended application. That all these things in the editing form map straight to what you're seeing here on the public view. If we get into the technical tab on here, you see we're set to the input type is user input text, and it can take English, German, or French, plain text. And then we've added some samples. So the way that you add these samples, like I say, is you give a tag which is sort of short description of the sample text. If it's a textual sample, you can just put the text in line. But if it's longer text or if it's audio or whatever, then you upload a file with the sample's location. So we've got here a German sample, we've got an English sample, and we've got a French sample. And those show up in two places. They show under the input records on here, but they will also show up in the tryout GUI. So the way we have a sort of standard set of trial UIs for the services, where you can, so standard UIs that work for translation, summarization, information extraction, speech to text, and so on. And any samples that you declare in the metadata record will be pulled in by these UIs. So I can just click on the English sample and it will set it here, and then I can submit the I thought I could submit that anyway. I will have to. Typically, these things never work when you try to demonstrate them publicly, but I will see. I might just need to reload the page. Yeah, that's my. I think probably just my authentication token had expired because I'd left it too long. So that I'll just leave that one running there. But yeah, so this tryout UI, you can say, pulls in things like the samples and the parameter metadata that you declare over here. So in this case, we've got, say, the inputs and the outputs, and then the parameter definitions are given down the bottom here. So you can sort of declare these, and what the way these are represented is that the user specifies them as query parameters on the URL when they call your service from outside, and they come through to your code in that params section of the JSON that Rémi was pointing at before. That's those that's how those work. So obviously, in a lot of cases, you don't necessarily need parameters. So, for example, for things like if you've got a multilingual translation system, say, we would generally recommend that if you've got one translation container that can translate several different languages, we would recommend you represent that as several separate metadata records in the catalogue, one for each language pair, rather than one record with a parameter for the language. It's, I think it's kind of, it helps with the findability and with being able to search for them by search for the services by language facets. It's useful that way around, I think. So in most cases for the translation services, say if you've got a multilingual translator, we do tend to use we do tend to have the each language pair represented separately. But that's just to kind of give you an idea of how all this stuff fits together. The distribution, like we said, the Docker. This is the download location, and the execution location is relative to the container, and in this case, it's MIT license, and that all shows up over here. So it shows up because we've said it's not private. We publish the Docker pull location, the Docker image location in the metadata here, and as you can see, we ran the service, and it returned so that was the original text, and this is the summary that it returned, and this is all this is essentially like a tryout GUI that calls the public API. So I think that's pretty much all of it covered for this. The code samples tab, as we said before, is one which gives you some examples of how you could call this service from code. And at this point, I'm going to hand back to Rémi to just run through an example of how we might call the service that we've just produced using the Python SDK. Rémi, I will hand back to you at this point.
Yes. I will be very quick because we are out of time. Just to let you know, so as I said, we have our Python package to run services, but also to help creating new services. And so it works as follow. After having assigned it, you can import the service class, and with this service class, you can initialize the service. As you have to be logged in inside ELG, you will have to register and to copy paste this code here in order to use the service, and then you will be able to call the service. So here I simply initialize the service from its ID, and call the ID by simply putting the text inside it. And after that, so this is still running, but we are well coding the multi-documents, multilingual summarization service, and the output should now be here. So we can see that the summary is here. The only thing I wanted to mention is that it's also possible to initialize a service with a specific scope. So a scope, it is to obtain a token that won't expire after 6 hours, but will be usable for every time. So for example, if you want to integrate a service into your service, you don't want to authenticate to ELG every 6 hours. So by using this offline access scope, you will see that the token you will obtain will expire in 100 years. So this is the only thing I wanted to mention, and I will stop now because we are out of time. Thanks.
Thank you, Rémi. Indeed, we have run out of time, but I'll briefly go through the with the presentation how to share datasets and models. It's pretty much the same as you do for services. I mean, you can again use the interactive editor or upload XML files. You will fill in the name of the resource. The difference here is that when you do that, you're also prompted to upload files. If you don't have it yet, you don't have to do it now. You can start creating the metadata and upload it later. The editor, as Ian has shown to you, there's a basic tab, which this is the same for all language resources. There's a tab specific for corpora with information that I showed you during the first presentation, the first part of the presentation, with a subclass and the GDPR related information. And there's also a tab for parts. If it's only a text corpus or an audio corpus, you just select the specific part and you're prompted to add the information that I will show you afterwards, which is specific to the media type combination. And if you have a multimedia corpus, which is composed of different parts, when you finish the first one, you will be prompted to add another one. add another corpus part here, or another lexical conceptual resource part. Depending on the media part, you're asked to fill in different information. The common information for all is language. As Ian has showed you, we have we allow BCP47 language tags, so you can specify regional variants, etc. And depending on the media type, we also ask for different types of classification, for instance, text type or video genre or speech genre. The distribution tab is quite similar to that of services. I mean, you specify what the distribution form is, but it's different for datasets. They can be downloadable or accessible through interfaces, or as in the case of the Korean example that we have mentioned before, and that was demonstrated in the Metaforum conference, it could be accessible through a Sparkle query. Licensing is similar, but we have a very specific part for the physical files that are typical of text or audio parts. So you have to fill in size and format or character encoding for text corpora, but duration for audio and video corpora. There are some fine-tuning there. The most important difference with services is that for datasets that you want to upload and host in ELG, you can do that, or you can simply add a URL where they are accessed from. But if you want to upload the datasets, you go to the data tab and you click on upload data. You upload a file. For now, we only allow zip files. They have to be packaged. We don't have any further specifications on what is inside the zip file. When completed, you will see the following screen. As you can see, you have uploaded the dataset, but you also have to assign it to a distribution. You go back to the distribution tab, and if you have set it to downloadable, then you get this picture, this element that allows you to associate the dataset with the distribution. This is because we allow multiple files, multiple datasets to be uploaded for each resource. For instance, you might have a dataset in a CSV format, but also as an XML format, and you can upload them as two different distributions so that they're easier to process. Yes, we do know that this is a complex procedure. Yes, we do know that this is a complex metadata editor, but we have to accommodate different requirements for different applications. And finally, as for services, when you are done, you submit the record for publication and we will contact you for any issues. You'll find all the contacts on the slides that we will share afterwards. And I will stop the presentation here. And I think we have time for one or two questions now. Sorry for taking a little bit longer than we expected for this tutorial. So I don't know if we have any questions.
Not at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So everything has already been answered through the Q&A tool.
Yeah, I think what I would say is if you have any specific questions, you can always approach us through the ticket system or the contact form. It's all in the feedback section on my grid. We're always happy to answer questions, and obviously when you do get into submitting your services, then there'll be a back and forth one-to-one with your technical validators to make sure everything's in order.
Yes, and I've also added the contact link for at the chat for everyone. Okay.
There's one question maybe that we could quickly take, which is, Ian is already answering.
Yeah, I'll take that one. So Hector is asking, is there a good way to test the API responses of compliant ELG services before they're uploaded to ELG? The answer to that is, I think we have some bits and pieces available. One thing that I have put together is essentially a set of configuration files for Docker Compose, which is essentially a way of running sort of stacks of related Docker services. So there's a repository that I will drop a link in the chat in a minute, which is a set of Compose stacks that will allow you to run your LT service container with the sort of the infrastructure containers, the trial GUI and the execution server, such that you can actually test everything on localhost before you come to uploading. So I'll drop a link in the chat to that repository.
And they have something similar without Docker Compose, just the execution server and your language technology service tool.
Okay.
There are no further questions.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to thank all the participants for their interest in ELT. Please go and visit it, both for using the resources, and we do hope that we'll soon have your own resources uploaded at ELT as well, services integrated or data resources. Feel free to contact us at any time if you have any questions. And I would like to thank you all for being patient with us for this delay in the time, and thank the organizers as well, from especially the DFKI team that has made this Meta Forum an excellent experience. And all the presenters
and
as
many thanks to the four of you for organizing this workshop. I think this was very informative and helpful. So I think we wrap it up. Thanks again, everyone, and stay healthy, and let's stay in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Hopefully next time, physical meeting.
Absolutely.
Bye.